200 leaders from different businesses in Mexico going to Toronto, going to Montreal, meeting with senior politicians, meeting with senior business people here, showing that they're interested in increasing our ties and not going to be drawn into that sort of trap by Donald Trump. I think it's a wise move.
More than 240 Mexican companies just arrived in Canada for the largest Mexico-Canada trade mission in recent memory, bringing over 1,800 business meetings to Toronto and Montreal at one of the most politically sensitive moments in North American trade. On the surface, this looked like a business delegation. In reality, it looked much more like a warning to Washington. As Donald Trump ramps up tariffs and prepares for a contentious USMCA review, Canada and Mexico are quietly moving closer together instead of pulling apart. And for Prime Minister Mark Carney, that shift is becoming part of a much larger strategy: reduce Canada's vulnerability before Trump turns North American trade into another political pressure campaign. Ironically, the harder Washington pushes, the faster Ottawa and Mexico City may be learning to coordinate around it. So if Trump thought tariffs would split Canada and Mexico apart, what happens when they start coordinating instead? Watch until the end, because the deeper story here is not just about trade, it's about how Trump's pressure may be reshaping North America itself. And don't forget to subscribe for the latest Canada-US developments and analysis. To understand why this matters so much, we need to look at what just happened between Canada and Mexico. The meetings took place just weeks before critical USMCA review discussions begin between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Mexico's Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard both emphasized long-term cooperation in sectors that are now central to North American economic security: manufacturing, transportation, critical minerals, energy, aerospace, agri-food, finance, and advanced industrial supply chains. The scale of the mission itself was revealing. Canada-Mexico trade already exceeded $60 billion in 2025, but officials from both governments openly acknowledged that the relationship still has enormous room to grow. That is especially important because both economies remain heavily dependent on the United States. More than 70% of exports from both countries still flow into the American market. For years, that integration looked like stability. But under Trump's second-term tariff strategy, many policymakers in Ottawa and Mexico City increasingly see it as exposure. Washington is continuing aggressive tariff policies on steel, aluminum, autos, and industrial products, while also preparing to push new amendments during the USMCA review process. And this is exactly where the political atmosphere begins to change, because both Canada and Mexico now appear deeply aware of the same risk. If Washington negotiates from a divide-and-conquer position, both countries become weaker individually. So instead of waiting to be pressured separately, Ottawa and Mexico City are beginning to align earlier.
Prime Minister Carney has been engaged in reaching out to trading partners around the world. Mexico has been working in the same direction.
The business community in Canada and Mexico have a common problem. Their closest neighbor, their top trading partner, has turned inward, has put up barriers, literally and figuratively. And so they need to look elsewhere. They need to diversify. They need a ground game if they are going to be victorious in this.
Trump's White House is not approaching the USMCA review as a routine administrative exercise. Washington wants tighter rules of origin, stronger controls tied to Chinese supply chains, expanded leverage over industrial sectors, and more flexibility to impose trade pressure when political disputes emerge. That matters because Canada and Mexico are deeply integrated into the industries most vulnerable to tariff escalation. The North American auto sector alone supports millions of jobs and hundreds of billions of dollars in annual production across all three countries. Disruptions to steel, aluminum, batteries, EV components, rail systems, and industrial machinery ripple across the continent almost immediately. And yet, Washington continues treating tariffs not as emergency tools, but as long-term instruments of economic pressure. From Ottawa's perspective, that fundamentally changes the nature of the relationship. One of the most important details from these meetings was not the trade deals themselves, it was the coordination. Officials from both countries openly discussed strategy ahead of negotiations with Washington, including how to avoid being separated politically during the review process. That reflects a lesson learned from the original NAFTA renegotiations, when Trump's strategy relied heavily on isolating Canada and Mexico from one another. This time, both governments appear determined not to repeat that mistake. And frankly, Canada has strong reasons to push this approach. Mark Carney's government increasingly views economic diversification as a matter of strategic resilience, not simply trade policy. Ottawa has spent months expanding outreach toward Europe, South Korea, ASEAN economies, and Indo-Pacific partners, while also strengthening industrial cooperation with Mexico. Because once access to the American market becomes a political weapon, dependence becomes vulnerability. This is where the story becomes bigger than one trade mission. Canada is quietly restructuring how it thinks about economic security. For decades, Ottawa largely assumed stable access to the U.S. market would always remain the foundation of Canadian prosperity. Trump's return to aggressive tariff politics shattered that assumption. Carney's response has not been emotional, it has been strategic. Canada is expanding LNG infrastructure, investing in critical minerals, strengthening Arctic and Pacific trade routes, developing new industrial partnerships, and actively looking for ways to increase non-U.S. exports over the long term. Mexico increasingly fits into that strategy because the two economies complement each other naturally. Mexico brings manufacturing scale and industrial labor capacity. Canada brings energy security, financing, engineering expertise, aerospace technology, agricultural strength, and critical mineral supply chains. Together, they create a more balanced North American network that is less exposed to sudden political shocks coming out of Washington. And there is already evidence that Canadian businesses are beginning to move in this direction. According to trade and investment data released earlier this year, Canadian direct investment in Mexico now exceeds $40 billion, with major exposure across banking, rail transportation, aerospace, mining, energy infrastructure, and manufacturing. Companies like Bombardier, TC Energy, CN Rail, Scotiabank, and Air Canada are all expanding operations tied to the Mexican market. At the same time, Mexico remains one of the fastest-growing destinations for Canadian export diversification strategies as firms attempt to reduce long-term dependence on U.S.-only supply chains. That shift matters because it suggests Ottawa's diversification strategy is no longer theoretical, capital is already moving. And ironically, Trump's pressure may be accelerating that process faster than anyone expected. There is another irony here that is becoming harder to ignore. The United States depends enormously on the very North American integration Trump keeps destabilizing. Combined U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico now approaches $1.6 trillion annually. Millions of American jobs depend directly on stable continental supply chains tied to manufacturing, transportation, energy, mining, and agriculture. Even major American auto groups are now warning Washington not to dismantle the trilateral trade framework too aggressively. Industry leaders have warned that breaking integrated North American supply chains could raise vehicle costs, reduce manufacturing efficiency, and weaken U.S. competitiveness against Asia and Europe. Mexico's auto sector has already reportedly lost around 60,000 jobs amid tariff uncertainty and supply chain disruption. But American manufacturers are also facing rising costs across steel, aluminum, copper, machinery, and industrial logistics. In other words, this is no longer just a Canada or Mexico problem. Trump's trade strategy is beginning to create instability inside the broader North American system itself. And that instability is pushing Canada and Mexico closer together instead of further apart. Trump believed economic pressure would strengthen Washington's leverage over North America, but the opposite may be unfolding. Canada and Mexico are beginning to realize that coordinating together may be the only way to avoid being pressured separately. And under Mark Carney, Canada appears increasingly willing to embrace that reality. This is not an anti-American alliance. It is something potentially more important. A defensive economic realignment designed to reduce vulnerability inside an increasingly unstable trade environment. Because the deeper Trump pushes tariffs, pressure tactics, and industrial leverage, the more Canada and Mexico may conclude that North America needs stronger cooperation between them, not just dependence on Washington. And that may become one of the defining geopolitical.
A new lobby group has been established working on behalf of Japanese companies building vehicles in southern Ontario. Toyota and Honda have combined to form the Pacific Manufacturing Association of Canada. The two companies accounted for about 3/4 of vehicles produced in Canada last year.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford is denying claims made by a Japanese media outlet that Honda is considering moving production out of Canada.
Toyota and Honda are not leaving Canada. In fact, they're doing the exact opposite, locking in their position and coordinating from inside the country. This comes at a moment when Donald Trump's 25% auto tariffs were supposed to force production back into the United States. That was the plan: pressure Canada, disrupt supply chains, and pull the industry south. But instead of relocating, two of the biggest global automakers have chosen to stay, and more importantly, to anchor their strategy in Canada. That shift tells you everything. Because this is no longer just about tariffs or trade policy. It's about where companies choose to operate when the system becomes unstable. And right now, they're choosing Canada. As of 2026, the North American auto industry is under sustained pressure from U.S. trade policy. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has imposed and threatened sweeping tariffs on vehicles and components from Canada and Mexico, aiming to accelerate reshoring. The impact has been immediate, but not in the way policymakers anticipated. Honda, which operates a major facility in Alliston, Ontario, employing around 4,200 workers, has confirmed that production will continue at full capacity. Toyota has taken the same stance across its Canadian plants, maintaining operations despite mounting cost pressures. At the same time, both companies have taken a coordinated step forward. They have joined forces to create the Pacific Manufacturing Association of Canada, a joint industry platform representing roughly 75% of Canada's total vehicle production. This is not a retreat under pressure. It is a repositioning under stress. North America's auto sector was never designed to operate within rigid national boundaries. It evolved as a fully integrated system where parts, components, and finished vehicles move fluidly across borders. That system is now under strain. Tariffs introduced by the United States are not just increasing costs, they are disrupting the logic of integration itself. A single vehicle assembled in Canada may include parts from multiple U.S. states and Mexican suppliers. When each border crossing carries added cost, the entire model becomes less efficient. The numbers are already reflecting that strain. Tariffs have added tens of billions of dollars in new costs across the global automotive sector. Vehicle prices across North America have climbed, in some cases by several $1,000s per unit. Even domestic U.S. production is facing higher input costs due to tariffs on steel and aluminum. This is not a targeted adjustment. It is systemic pressure. But cost is only part of the story. The deeper issue is uncertainty. Policy direction in Washington has become increasingly difficult to predict. Tariffs are introduced, revised, delayed, and sometimes contradicted within short timeframes. Trade rules tied to USMCA are under review, reinterpretation, or political negotiation. For an industry that plans investments over 5 to 10 years, this is a fundamental problem. Executives are not just asking how much tariffs will cost, they are asking whether the rules will remain stable long enough to justify any major decision. And right now, the answer is unclear. This uncertainty has effectively frozen large segments of the industry. Expansion plans are delayed. New investments are reconsidered. Strategic decisions are postponed. In a sector that depends on long-term certainty, short-term volatility becomes a structural risk. This is where Toyota and Honda's strategy becomes clear. They are not trying to outmaneuver the system. They are trying to stabilize within it. Canada offers something increasingly rare in the current environment: predictability. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the Canadian approach has been consistent. There have been no abrupt policy reversals, no sudden tariff escalations, and no attempts to weaponize trade policy in unpredictable ways. Instead, Canada has maintained a steady, rules-based framework that allows companies to plan with a degree of confidence. That stability is not theoretical. It translates directly into operational decisions. When faced with a choice between a volatile policy environment and a stable one, companies will often choose the latter, even if costs are not dramatically lower, because in the long run, unpredictability is more expensive than any tariff. That is why Toyota and Honda are not leaving. They are anchoring. Another signal of this shift is how companies are behaving toward each other. Toyota and Honda are direct competitors in the global market, yet in Canada, they have chosen to collaborate. The formation of a joint industry group is not just about advocacy, it is about coordination in an uncertain environment. When the system itself becomes unstable, competition becomes secondary. The priority shifts to preserving the conditions that allow the industry to function. By aligning their efforts, these companies are building a collective position within Canada. They are preparing not only to manage current tariff pressures, but to influence future trade negotiations, particularly the upcoming USMCA review. This is a long-term move, and it is rooted in the assumption that Canada will remain a viable base. Canada's role in this story is not defined by aggressive action. It is defined by restraint. While the United States is actively reshaping trade policy through tariffs and negotiation pressure, Canada has taken a more measured approach. It has avoided dramatic policy swings and focused instead on maintaining a stable environment for investment. That approach may not generate headlines, but it generates confidence, and confidence is what drives capital allocation. Canada does not need to outbid the United States. It does not need to outmaneuver it politically. It simply needs to remain consistent while others introduce volatility. That is its advantage. What we are seeing now is not a full realignment of the North American auto industry, but it is the beginning of a shift. Companies are no longer optimizing purely for cost. They are optimizing for resilience. That means diversifying production, balancing risk across regions, and anchoring operations in locations where policy is stable. Canada fits that profile. Toyota and Honda's decision to remain and coordinate in Canada is a reflection of this broader shift. It is not a rejection of the United States. It is a recalibration of risk. And in that recalibration, Canada becomes more than a participant. It becomes a reference point. Beyond autos, this shift is already visible in adjacent sectors. Canada's exports of critical minerals, aluminum, and energy inputs, key components in vehicle production, have become even more strategically important as supply chains fragment. The country supplies a significant share of U.S. aluminum and remains a top provider of energy imports, reinforcing its role not just as a manufacturing base, but as a foundational supplier. As companies rethink supply chain security, Canada's combination of resource depth and policy stability is turning it into a long-term anchor, not just for vehicles, but for the entire industrial ecosystem that supports them. Donald Trump's tariff strategy was intended to bring clarity to the system, build in America or pay the price. But instead, it has introduced a different kind of reality. Costs have risen, uncertainty has increased, and the system that once operated seamlessly across North America is now under visible strain. In that environment, companies are not rushing to relocate. They are looking for stability. Toyota and Honda have made their choice. They are not chasing short-term incentives or reacting to political pressure. They are anchoring their operations in a place where the rules are still clear. And right now, that place is Canada. The question going forward is not whether tariffs will continue to reshape the industry. It's whether stability will ultimately matter more than power. Because if it does, Canada may not just be holding the line. It may be defining the next phase of North American manufacturing.